In 1947, a young shepherd threw a stone into a cave near the Dead Sea, and history changed forever. Inside, archaeologists uncovered what became known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, ancient texts filled with prayers, laws, and sacred writings. But in 1952, something entirely different appeared. Instead of fragile parchment or leather, one scroll was hammered into sheets of copper. To even read it, scientists had to literally cut the metal apart. And what they found was shocking: a list that looked less like scripture and more like a treasure map. The copper scroll was not found in the first wave of discoveries that made the Dead Sea Scrolls famous. It was uncovered in 1952, in one of the Qumran caves overlooking the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. By that point, archaeologists had already pulled dozens of jars and hundreds of fragile parchment and papyrus scrolls from the caves. Most of those texts were religious in nature: biblical manuscripts, hymns, commentaries, and rules for a strict religious community. But the copper scroll immediately stood apart. Unlike the others, it was not written on parchment. It was literally etched onto thin sheets of hammered copper, rolled tightly into two sections. When scholars began to analyze it, they dated the scroll to around the 1st century CE, more specifically close to 70 CE, one of the most turbulent and tragic eras in Jewish history. That was the year when the Roman legions under General Titus crushed the first Jewish revolt, besieging Jerusalem and ultimately destroying the Second Temple, the very heart of Jewish religious life. This cataclysm was not only a military defeat but also a cultural and spiritual trauma. For centuries afterward, the destruction of the temple would mark Jewish memory as a symbol of loss and exile. It is within this context that the copper scroll gains its aura of mystery. The scroll does not contain prayers, laws, or teachings. Instead, it reads like a treasure list. Line after line describes caches of gold, silver, vessels, and sacred objects supposedly hidden in various locations. Scholars believe the treasures it lists could have been items once belonging to the temple in Jerusalem, perhaps even ritual vessels or offerings that priests and rebels attempted to save before the Romans advanced. If so, the copper scroll may represent one of the few surviving voices of desperation from that fateful time, a cryptic record left behind in hopes that someone might one day retrieve what was hidden. The copper scroll also links back to the larger story of the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves. When the first scrolls were discovered in 1947, they were quickly associated with an ancient Jewish sect believed to have lived in the nearby ruins of Qumran. Most scholars identify this sect with the Essenes, a strict, ascetic group who withdrew from the cities to live a purer life in the desert. The scrolls discovered, hymns, commentaries, apocalyptic prophecies, and sectarian rules, matched what ancient historians like Josephus had written about the Essenes. If the Essenes were indeed the guardians of the Qumran library, the copper scroll raises fascinating questions. Why would such a group, known for their simple lifestyle and rejection of wealth, record a list of hidden treasure? Was the scroll even theirs? Some researchers argue that it could have been placed in the caves later, perhaps by Jewish priests fleeing Jerusalem during the Roman siege. Others suggest that even if the Essenes themselves did not value gold and silver, they might have preserved the scroll because it was connected to the temple, which they still regarded as sacred despite their estrangement from mainstream Judaism. The timing of the copper scroll's creation, near the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, strengthens the theory that it was written in an atmosphere of crisis. The Jewish revolt against Rome, which began in 66 CE, was fueled by resentment of Roman taxation, religious restrictions, and political corruption. At first, Jewish rebels gained surprising victories, even defeating a Roman legion. But Rome responded with overwhelming force. By 70 CE, Jerusalem was under siege. The temple, the most sacred site in Judaism, was burned and destroyed. Countless lives were lost and survivors were scattered into exile. In such desperate circumstances, it is not hard to imagine priests and community leaders deciding to safeguard the temple's wealth. If they believed the sanctuary would fall, they may have hidden ritual objects and offerings in caves, valleys, or underground cisterns, recording their locations on a durable medium like copper so that future generations could recover them. The copper scroll, then, is more than just a treasure map. It is a whisper from the edge of annihilation, a record of faith, fear, and hope left behind by people who believed their sacred heritage might outlast the empire that destroyed them. Whether created by the Essenes or by refugees from Jerusalem, the copper scroll is deeply tied to the religious and political upheaval of the 1st century. It connects the famous Dead Sea Scrolls to one of the defining events of Jewish history, the destruction of the temple by Rome, and it hints at treasures, both physical and spiritual, still waiting to be uncovered. When scholars finally managed to open the mysterious copper scroll, they realized immediately that it was unlike any other of the Dead Sea Scrolls. While the majority of the manuscripts discovered at Qumran dealt with scripture, religious commentaries, or community rules, this one read like a treasure map. Instead of prayers or philosophy, it contained a list of hidden deposits of gold and silver, each described in astonishing detail. One of the first entries stunned researchers. In the ruin of the Valley of Acre, under the steps, 40 talents of silver. A single talent in ancient times weighed roughly 30 kilograms, so this one note alone described more than a metric ton of silver. And this was only one entry. The scroll contained a total of 64 locations. Each entry followed a similar pattern. It gave a specific landmark, a cave, a spring, a ruin, or a step, and then listed the weight and type of treasure hidden there. Some mentioned gold, others silver, and still others sacred vessels, possibly looted from the Jewish temple. In total, the treasure described amounts to hundreds of tons of precious metal. If the scroll is accurate, it represents what would be the single greatest ancient treasure hoard ever recorded. The style of writing was also unusual. Unlike the poetic or religious tone of the other Dead Sea Scrolls, the copper scroll was written in a blunt, matter-of-fact way. Almost like an inventory sheet, it simply listed, in the cistern by the monument of Absalom, 40 talents of silver. In the cave near Jericho, 70 talents of gold. There were no stories, no moral lessons, only directions. This made scholars believe it was written with a very practical purpose in mind, to actually guide someone to retrieve the hidden wealth. This raised huge questions. Whose treasure was it? Many scholars argue it must have been connected to the Second Temple in Jerusalem, destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. As Roman armies advanced, Jewish priests or rebels might have tried to hide the temple's wealth before it could be captured. Others suggest it could have belonged to the Essenes, the Jewish sect associated with Qumran, who may have buried their communal wealth to protect it. Still others believe it might represent loot from the Jewish revolt against Rome, hidden away as a reserve to fund future resistance. The scroll's material also hinted at its importance. Instead of fragile parchment or papyrus, it was hammered onto sheets of copper mixed with a bit of tin. This was not a medium used casually. Copper was durable, meant to last through centuries. The choice suggests that whoever recorded this inventory wanted the information preserved for the long term, even if it meant great expense and difficulty in engraving it. Yet despite the clear directions, the treasure has never been found. Archaeologists have searched the areas mentioned, from the Valley of Acre near Jericho to caves around Jerusalem, but with no success. Some think the descriptions are deliberately vague, hiding the real locations. Others suggest the treasure was already recovered centuries ago, perhaps even by the Romans themselves. And of course there is the possibility that the scroll is not literal at all, but symbolic or exaggerated. But what if it is real? Estimates suggest that the treasure described could amount to more than 200 tons of gold and silver. At modern values, that would be worth billions of dollars. Beyond the money, though, the cultural and religious significance would be priceless. These could be sacred artifacts of the Second Temple, vessels used in rituals, or donations from generations of worshippers. For historians, the copper scroll remains both a tantalizing clue and a maddening mystery. It gives just enough detail to spark hope, but not enough to provide certainty. Every line reads like an invitation to adventure. In the tomb at the crossing of the valley, under the large stone, 17 talents of gold. If even a fraction of the entries are true, it could change our understanding of the wealth, power, and desperation of the Jewish people in the final days before Rome's conquest. The copper scroll is in essence an ancient riddle written in metal, one that hints at unimaginable treasure, but still refuses to give up its secrets. The copper scroll continues to divide historians, archaeologists, and treasure hunters even today. At the heart of the debate lies a simple but powerful question. Is it myth or reality? Some scholars argue that the copper scroll was never meant to be taken literally. They believe it was a symbolic document, a kind of sacred riddle or metaphor. According to this interpretation, the listed treasures were not piles of gold and silver, but spiritual riches, knowledge, wisdom, or religious truths hidden away for future generations. Just as other Dead Sea Scrolls contain symbolic language and coded references, the copper scroll might be describing the treasures of faith rather than physical wealth. But not everyone agrees. Other experts insist that the scroll is, in fact, a genuine inventory of treasure hidden during one of the darkest moments in Jewish history. They point to the very practical language of the text. Unlike allegorical or poetic scripture, the copper scroll reads more like an instruction manual. Precise locations, specific measurements, weights of gold and silver. That kind of detail, they argue, makes little sense as mere metaphor. If this interpretation is correct, then the treasure may have been the sacred wealth of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, hidden away by priests or rebels as Roman forces closed in during the Jewish revolt of the 1st century. These were vessels, offerings, and vast donations given by generations of worshippers, too precious to be left in Roman hands. Yet, despite decades of searching, no trace of the treasure has ever been found. Was it looted centuries ago? Still buried in the deserts of Judea? Or was it never real to begin with? The mystery of the Copper Scroll continues to fuel both academic debate and the imagination of treasure hunters worldwide. Over the decades, historians and researchers have proposed several theories to explain the true meaning of the Copper Scroll and the fate of the treasure it describes. 1. Temple treasure theory. According to one popular view, the items listed in the Copper Scroll were the treasures of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. As Roman forces advanced during the Jewish revolt, priests and rebels may have secretly transported the sacred vessels, gold, and silver out of the city. The scroll, therefore, would be an inventory of where these treasures were hidden, ensuring that they could one day be recovered. 2. Roman loot theory. Another theory suggests that by the time the Copper Scroll was written, the Romans had already seized the temple treasures. Historical records show that Roman generals, especially Titus, looted Jerusalem during the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. If this is true, then the scroll may be describing wealth that was never actually hidden, but had already fallen into Roman hands and paraded through Rome as spoils of war. 3. Decoy theory. Some scholars propose that the Copper Scroll was a deliberate decoy, a clever attempt to mislead. By recording false locations, Jewish leaders could have distracted enemies or even later treasure seekers, protecting the real treasures by sending them on a wild chase. In this view, the scroll's precise-sounding instructions are not a guide but a trap. 4. Still hidden theory. The most thrilling possibility is that the treasure is still out there, buried somewhere in the Judean Desert near the Dead Sea. Advocates of this theory argue that since no evidence has been found to disprove the scroll's claims, the possibility remains that vast amounts of gold and silver still lie untouched beneath the sands and rocks, waiting to be discovered. Together, these theories fuel the ongoing mystery. Was the Copper Scroll an ancient inventory, a trick, or simply a lost legend? The Copper Scroll treasure remains one of history's most fascinating mysteries, where archaeology, history, and legend intertwine. Unlike the other Dead Sea Scrolls which speak of faith and scripture, this copper text dares to describe hidden wealth, a record that blurs the line between fact and myth. If the treasure described in the scroll were ever discovered, it would not only be the largest ancient hoard of gold and silver ever found but also a groundbreaking revelation about Judaism, the Roman conquest, and the desperate final days of the Second Temple. Such a discovery could rewrite what we know about one of the most turbulent periods in ancient history. Until that day, however, the Copper Scroll remains an unsolved riddle. Its words continue to spark curiosity, inspire treasure hunters, and challenge scholars to search for answers buried deep in the desert sands. It is a mystery that refuses to die, a whisper from the past, still waiting to be unlocked.